board. All right. Thank you everyone for joining today. Everyone who was able to come to our modified time. Today we are going to have a presentation by Dr. Rasmussen. Am I saying your name correctly?
Yeah.
Okay, good. In ethics and research. So do you have something? Do you need to share your screen?
I will.
Okay, awesome. All right, everyone. So we are going to hand it over to hear about ethics in research.
All right, there we go. And I'm sorry if I'm looking back and forth. I've got 3 screens and only my laptop has a webcam. So it's like behind my screen. So thank you all for coming and for having me. I thought I would just describe myself a little bit so that you know where I'm coming from. I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy, and my specialty is medical ethics and research ethics. And on campus, I'm a faculty fellow in the graduate school, focusing on issues of research integrity and ethics. So we do some mentorship training for faculty. We're conducting an authorship intervention that's from an NSF grant at the moment on campus. So this is my area where I work and research. And so I'm going to give you a really whirlwind tour of all the issues in research ethics, each of which could be practically a semester course on its own, in particular when we talk about human subject research. But I wanted mostly to give you a sense of what all the areas are in research ethics, because there's so many that we might not think about as being part of that realm. So and there's going to be a little bit of audience participation a little bit later, but I'll get you ready for that. So the first question is, and if we were in a classroom, I would sort of throw this all out to you, but it's a little more difficult, especially because I can't see anybody raising their hands on my screen right now. Just to invite you to think rhetorically about what is research ethics or the responsible conduct of research. And do feel free to use the chat as well to kind of throw in what you think might be some, I'll pull it up myself, some answers to that question, right? What is research ethics? Well, essentially, the way it's been defined is making sure that the research that gets out into the public, particularly to build on for policy, for healthcare, whatever, has integrity, is rigorous, is honest, not fraudulent. But there's a lot of other pieces of responsible conduct of research as well that help to contribute to that, like managing your data correctly, making sure you're not abusing animals or violating the autonomy of people. So we'll talk about a little bit about that as well. Figure out how, there we go. So then the next question that comes up for a lot of people is, okay, well, why do I have to learn how to be an ethical person? I'm either ethical or I'm not. So I will just not lie about my research and then I'm good, right? And my point here is that it's true that we can't do much about you if you're a bad person, but there's lots of ways in which you might actually get something wrong in research without realizing it. So for example, and we also can be lazy, right? Or imperfect. So sometimes we have a socially acceptable practice we later deem wrong. Using, for example, children in an institution with cognitive disabilities to test hepatitis transmission on them, which has happened in the United States. And we thought that was socially acceptable at the time. Now we don't. We might get into something like this by accident. We might think it's a minor level wrong that we try to justify. So for example, when you have a bunch of data points and there's the outlier, right? If we remove the outlier, the curve looks so much nicer on the graph. And so let's just do that. It's not a big deal. It's just one data point, right? So these are minor level wrongs. You might be missing something morally important, especially if you're using new methods. One of the most famous cases in research misconduct came about because a postdoc was working on a new area. It was just new to all of us, and nobody quite understood the right way to do the methods. And so she thought that her PI was fabricating evidence, which it turned out he was not. You can also, and this is much more likely, get involved in research ethics violations because other people are doing things wrong, not you. Sometimes it's just not clear what the right thing is, and sometimes we deceive ourselves. So these are all reasons why you might want to pay attention to research ethics issues, even if you're a good person and that's important to you. So the moral foundations of research are basically conducting research to do good for humans, animals, the planet, future generations, or something, via the pursuit of truth and knowledge, a better understanding of the world the way it is, either in the very abstract, what do micro particles look like, or the very concrete, how is COVID transmitted? We also have a duty to respect individuals who are involved in that research with us, animals that we use in the pursuit of the research, and society. And then from each of these obligations, we have more specific ones that we can talk about, and they can be in tension with each other. So for example, if you have an obligation to search for truth, you have an obligation to tell the truth about that research, right? The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And so this is the way I kind of parse that out. The truth, telling the truth, is being honest about the research you actually did. The whole truth means including all of it, not just omitting parts of it that don't work out the way you wanted them to. And then nothing but the truth, like don't puff up your results to sort of try and imply that they're more than they are. And then to whom do we owe that truth and why? We owe it to the public because they give us lots of support for research in the academy in particular, but not only here. We owe it to individual research participants out of respect for their autonomy as moral beings. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. We owe it to our colleagues and collaborators because their research might be built on our research. We owe it to funding institutions for the money they give us. And we owe it to our sort of employers here at UNC Charlotte, for example, because they give us all the things that we need to do the research. And because if I lie about my research and I commit misconduct or violate principles against humans, then they can pay for it. My colleagues here at the university can pay for it because I've tarnished their name. So there's a lot of reasons to do the right thing. All right, so here are some of the main areas of research ethics. Research misconduct, which is known as falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism, FFP. Collaboration issues, there's, you know what it's like all you have to do is think about group work when you're in class, and you already see the same kinds of things that are going to happen to you if you do collaborative research with other people. There's the person who doesn't do anything. There's the person who does sloppy work. There's the person who tries to tell you what to do, right? So all of those things are still going on, unfortunately, when you become a researcher. Peer review is another issue. There are potential conflicts of interest or obligation. Complicity and funding sources, and then animal and human subject research. So like I said, this is a whirlwind. So we're going to talk about each of these things, starting with research misconduct. And so this is the official National Science Foundation definition. Research misconduct means fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. So plagiarism is misconduct in proposing or performing research funded by the NSF, reviewing research proposals submitted to NSF, or reporting research results funded by NSF. So fabrication, not surprisingly, is making up data or results. Falsification means things like manipulating research materials, equipment, or processes. So there have been a number of cases of research sabotage over the years. And for example, there was a graduate student, a postdoc at University of Michigan, I think, and her experiments kept dying in the little petri dishes. And she thought, this is strange. It smells like alcohol. There's no reason it should smell like alcohol. So she went and told her PI, her mentor, and they eventually got the on-campus police involved, and they installed a camera in the lab ceiling. And they eventually caught the postdoc, actually not even eventually, it was within 24 hours, opening up the refrigerator and spraying the alcohol in to kill her samples and then leaving. And when caught, he confessed, and he said he was doing it because she was making faster progress than he was. So these kinds of things count as research misconduct. And then plagiarism, hopefully you're very well familiar with, so I'm going to skip that one. But it doesn't include honest error or differences of opinion. And sometimes there are these blurry lines where you're trying to figure out, was this an honest error or was it not? So some examples of research misconduct include image manipulation, data fabrication, omission and suppression, plagiarism, sabotage, like I just told you about. And there's a whole website called retractionwatch.com, which keeps track of retracted articles. And there are, I don't know, 30,000 in their database now, and they've been going for about 10 years. So it's a big problem. And retraction happens, I should explain that, when someone brings up concerns about a paper, a publication of some sort. Those are investigated, found to be fraudulent, or include severe plagiarism in some cases, and then they're retracted from the literature. So they keep track of those. So here's just a quick example of image manipulation with the Western blot. And you probably can't really see any problem, but there are these ways that they have of putting filters on and then starting to be able to identify, for example, that one is rotated to make it look like a genuine test. And then another one is rotated over here. Similarly, these two bands are duplicated. And these are very kind of standard examples. There are a lot of these in retracted papers where they just kind of Photoshop things in. And now there are software programs called forensic droplets, where they can search images, and a lot of journals do this. They tell you basically it's like a plagiarism detector. When you have an image submitted with your paper that you're submitting for publication, they'll run it through this kind of a manipulation detector, and they find things. Okay, so moving on to the next issue we're going to talk about, collaboration issues. So I'm going to try and invite you to throw some things in the chat. If you can think about research ethics issues that might stem from collaboration, or if you want to put your mic on and jump in. Anyone? Or you can interpret this as group work.
Lisa, I always want to do the Bueller.
I do too, and I stopped doing that because nobody knows what it is.
Only you and I.
It's a great movie though. If you haven't seen Ferris Bueller's Day Off, you should watch it. Okay, so I'll stick some in here. Authorship. This is a huge, huge one. Improper credit. Thank you, Christopher. Yes. And so I think authorship is the most concrete example of that, but there are other examples, right? Intellectual property, another one that would be potentially involved in getting improper credit. Experimental rigor, you know, there's just those people who are not careful with the work that they do, and then you might get blamed for that. Good record keeping, same kind of thing, accurate calculations. So just all the issues. So here is where I'm going to stop sharing for 1 second, and I'm going to give you a link to a Google Doc because that'll be easier than trying to read. Hang on 1 second. Find my link. Here it is. Okay, here is Google Doc link. So I want you to go there. I'm going to tell you as you're pulling it up what it is. This is a list of 10 people, fictitious people who contribute to a paper. And what I want you to do is read it over and make 2 columns on a piece of scratch paper and decide who's an author and who's not an author in that list. And you can just put down the numbers, like number 1, number 2, don't worry about the titles. So I'm going to be quiet for about 60 seconds and hope that's enough for you to read. All right, so I'm going to go through and read them quickly so we're all kind of on the same page. But what I want you to do in the meantime is, for the ones that you think are authors, put them in order as you think they should be on the paper. So it'd be like 1, 2, 3, you know, if those are the people you thought should be authors in that order. All right, so the lab chief contributed to the experiment design and analysis, interpreted the data, edited several drafts of the manuscript. Program director obtained the funding, including salaries, supplies, and equipment. Technician trained the graduate students and did surgical procedures and some analyses. Postdoc, questions arising from their research spurred the lab chief to examine this research topic. Contributed to discussions regarding the experiment design and data analysis and interpretation. Graduate student, contributed to experiment design, conducted experiments, responsible for most data analysis and interpretation, wrote first draft, edited subsequent versions. The undergrad performed sample analysis, and the glassware washer is fairly straightforward. Animal caretaker provides specialized care. Departmental colleague read a draft and provided comments, and a colleague at another university shared a reagent. So you should have 2 columns, authors, non-authors. So when you're ready, I want you to put in the chat what you think the author order should be. Waiting for my first guinea pig here. It's a little harder to do it on Zoom, right? All right, maybe someone can tell me who they think should be an author, just one that they think should be an author. Okay, there we go. Thank you, Christopher. So we've got, what do the, person order, right? Okay, so I see. So the first author here would be number 5. Who's the graduate student. Then would be the postdoc. Then would be the undergrad assistant. And the technician. And then finally the lab chief. All right. Does anybody have anything that differs from that? And if so, go ahead and put it in the chat or unmute yourself and just jump in. Well, this is not going very well, y'all.
So Christopher had said that, let's see, person order. The graduate student should be considered an author. Raise your hand, use the emoji if you agree.
There you go.
Or you can use a thumbs down if you disagree.
All right, so then what about the undergraduate student? So everybody take off your hands, right? And so who thinks, raise your hand if you think the undergraduate research assistant should be an author. Zarin and Jackie, I can't tell if that was your previous, you're just leaving it up. Okay. Right, so somebody who doesn't think, thanks Jackie, somebody who does not think the undergrad should be on the authorship list. You want to just say why?
I can kind of answer that because I'm in a research lab right now.
Perfect.
And I know that I won't be given authorship if I don't contribute to the analysis or actually like helping to write the paper. I mean, I'm kind of like a helper rather than the author, unless
Yes.
I actually contribute that much.
Yeah, great. So there's a difference, and then we can think about this too with the glassware washer, for example. There's a difference between contributing labor to a project for which you should have some kind of compensation, right? And contributing intellectually or substantially to a project. And this is why none of you probably think that a glassware washer should be an author, but there's a little bit of disagreement about whether the undergrad should be an author or not. And some of that might come because some faculty, they want to do good things for their students. They know students' resumes look great if they have a publication, so they want to include the undergraduate student on the publication. But there are circumstances where that's a good thing and deserved, and some where they're not, right? And so if you just go out and give authorship to people who have maybe done just a little bit, it starts to make authorship a little less meaningful for the people who actually are meriting it on their papers. So you can start to see where, when I do this kind of in person and there are more answers, there's as many different answers as there are people who are answering, basically. And the moral of the story is we don't all agree about authorship. And so it's really important when you're involved in a project where you might be an author, or later if you're leading a project, to have conversations about authorship early and often and decide, how are we going to do this? What does it take to have authorship? Who's going to do that? If you're just washing the glasses or you're just taking care of the animals, why does that amount to authorship or not? So this is something we have, like I said, we have a project on campus focusing on this among graduate students, and there's an unbelievable amount of people who feel like they have either been cheated out of authorship, or they've seen somebody give authorship to someone they didn't think deserved it. And there's a lot of ill will that breeds as well. All right, so we'll move on from this. Collaborative issue, another example of this is management of and access to data. So who owns the data? And can lab notes and materials be taken off site? So I'm just going to answer that for you. No, because when there's a project done at an institution like this, if there's some question about it, there needs to be a way to go back and look at the materials. And so that material needs to stay with that lab or that PI. So just because you've done some data analysis here on campus doesn't mean you get to take the data notebook with you, for example. But then the deeper questions are, well, let's say I'm a graduate student and I'm working with my faculty member, and I go on, I get a job somewhere and I want to go on and do more of this research. And the faculty member said, well, no, I'm going to have my new graduate students do that work. You can't just go do it, right? So you have to kind of think about, as you're working together, how do you sort of separate happily, right, in a friendly way? And then who owns the data? What responsibilities do you have in documenting lab work? If you don't document this and somebody raises a question about it later, that can be a real problem for your PI, the whole institution, the department, etc. I'm going to go through peer review fairly quickly. What do you do if you're peer reviewing a paper and you learn something that could help you in your own research, right? You're supposed to keep this stuff confidential, so you don't just go say, oh, I read this great thing, you know, tweet about this confidential peer review you just done. But one of the questions is, what if you didn't expect this and all of a sudden you read a paper and you say, oh my gosh, that could solve the problem I've been dealing with in my lab? What would you do? Can graduate students read manuscripts on behalf of their professors? I know that this does happen, but the better way of it happening, so there's the bad way, which is a professor says, oh, here, read this paper and write a review of it and I'll turn it in, right? And then the professor gets the credit for doing the review. The editor of the journal thinks that it's an expert review, but it's really been handed off to a first-year graduate student who may not be an expert yet in that area. But a better way of doing it is when the professor says to the editor, hey, I'd like to involve my students so I can teach them what good peer reviewing looks like. Is that okay? The editor says yes. And then the professor and the graduate students get together and they talk about what makes this paper strong or weak, how to write a review and things like that. But these are complications that you might not know about automatically. What can you do to protect your intellectual property during the review process, right? It's supposed to be confidential. Nobody's supposed to steal it, but maybe they will, etc. All right, conflict of interest. Usually when we raise this phrase, we're thinking about money. we're thinking about somebody who's been paid by, let's say, Big Tobacco to come up with results that are favorable, that don't indicate that smoking can cause cancer, for example. Or name your pharmaceutical company, oil company, whatever, whoever has big money to give out might be interested in the outcomes. I read one, I don't know how many of you drink Wonderful, the pomegranate juice, right? But there's the company who owns that brand gave out money for health research based on pomegranates. And so, you know, there was this kind of period of time where we all started to hear about how pomegranate is one of those wonder fruits, superfoods, whatever, and we're all supposed to be drinking and eating it. Well, I don't even know if the research is good or bad, but the point is, it didn't happen that a researcher was just sitting there going, I wonder about pomegranate juice. So I should do some research on that, right? The Palm Wonderful company said, we're giving out grants. You can find out whatever you want to find out, but we've got the money, right? So we think about conflicts of interest in terms of finances. And having conflicting pulls between your personal interest in getting maybe more money from that company to do grants, or for your versus your professional obligations to tell the truth, like we started out talking about. So the most direct example is, I'm going to pay you to say something you know is untrue, right? That's pretty easy to say is a problem. The more indirect example, though, and more frequent, is knowing if you say something positive about a company that gave you a grant, you're probably going to be able to get a grant from them in the future. And if your results come up against that company, they're probably not going to fund you to undermine their interests in the future, right? And so it takes a very strong will to make sure that you are doing the very best science you can do so that you can be confident in the outcome, regardless of what it is, independent of the money. Another indirect example is when a funding agency may stipulate they have a right to decide whether you can publish your findings at all or delay publication. So let me take the second example first. In delaying a publication, they may have legitimate interest in filing patent claims, right? Because as soon as you publish something, then it's open for other people to use as well. So usually if you're doing anything that's patentable, they want a chance to file that paperwork before it goes out for review or publication. But there are companies that say, we have a right to review your work, to delay it by, I don't know, 6 months or something, independent of patents, but in some cases to plan a PR campaign that manages the problems that are likely to come from your research, or even just to prevent it from going out at all. So if you get money when you're doing research, you have to really look at these kinds of contracts. And typically, I believe, you would go through the campus office and they would look for these kinds of clauses and help protect you from those kinds of outcomes. Ghostwriting and ghost management in the medical literature is another example of this, where there are companies whose whole job it is to manage messages. And so they'll do things like write a paper with outcomes of research. They send it to a thought leader in the area and they say, we'd love to have your opinion on this. The thought leader gives their opinion and they say, wow, this is so amazing. We'd love to make you first author on the paper. Right. And so, wow, you've just done them a favor, and they think you're so amazing that they're going to make you first author of this paper that you did not write or do the research for. Right. So you're not controlling the message. You're not verifying whether the research was done well or poorly. You're not really able to be responsible for the claims made in that paper. So these kinds of things are being done behind the scenes to make sure that they come out in the right direction for the funding group, whoever that is. But related to this is also conflicts of obligation, where it's not so much about money, but when you have duties to 2 or more parties at the same time. So for example, all of us who are here on campus, who are research professors and also teaching, we have only so many hours in the day, right? We need to manage our students, our graduate students, our undergraduate students, teach them as well as we can, help them as we can. We also have to keep producing research, right? And then we also have to go to our committee meetings, not to mention our whole other worlds of family, friends, self, and things like that. And so you may have heard stories or be familiar with the kind of idea of the professor who's never here, right? They're famous, and so they're always being asked to go and give talks everywhere, but you're a graduate student working with them, and you never get to have time with them. You never get to be taught by them because they're always off gallivanting around. That's maybe too mean a way of putting it, right? They're in demand, right? But they have a conflict of obligation because they're not teaching you and mentoring you in the way that they ought to be, that you need for your career, because of that conflict. Okay, moving on, we've got complicity and funding. So this is when sometimes you're getting money from a source that gives you some moral heebie-jeebies, let's say, some pause. So for example, depending on what you think about stem cell research, that may not be something you want to engage in. You may be doing research in biology, but on something that could be used as a biological agent, has a dual purpose, right? If you're doing experiments on smallpox, for example, that can be weaponized. You may have an objection to certain war technologies, in which case maybe you don't want to get DoD funding, Department of Defense funding, but maybe certain kinds would be okay. So these ways of thinking about how morally pure do I need to be versus how morally unconscious can I be, right? So just to say, I'll take money from anybody may not be quite good enough, but to say I won't take it from anybody who compromises my moral values may not be realistic. I can't answer that for you, but all right. So animals in research, some of the deepest moral questions are, should we use them at all? And if so, why or why not? But if you think we can use them, are there limits to how we might treat them, and what are they, and what would justify those limits? So it used to be that people would do experiments on animals, I'm thinking, hundreds of years ago, because they didn't think that animals had souls, and therefore they couldn't feel pain. And so when they saw animals reacting as though they were in pain, they said, oh, it's just as if they had pain. They can't actually have pain because they don't have souls, right? So there's this way you have to make your mind see something in order to ignore the very clear signs of pain that the animal is having. But if you think that using animals in research is permissible, then what are the limits? And those have been identified, and these are these are the principles in general that animal research follows: refine, reduce, and replace. So refine means refine your experiments to cause less pain and distress to the animals. Don't do something, this bad when you can really back it up and get everything you need from much less. Reduce the number of animals used if possible. And that was in particular done a reduction when they dropped what's called the LD50 requirement for drug testing, which was the lethal dose. And what it meant was, what is the dose at which, when you give it to your entire animal population, half of them die, right? And that was eventually realized that was far, far too extreme to be warranted, to be needed. It wasn't, that data wasn't necessary to demonstrate what they were trying to show. And then finally, replacement means replacing higher order animals with lower order ones. So don't use a dog if you can use a guinea pig. Don't use a guinea pig if you can use a fish. Don't use a fish if you can use cells in a dish. And so the idea is do as little harm to living beings as you can based on what you need to do. And so, for example, the chimpanzees are hardly ever used in research anymore, partly for some of these reasons. They've phased them out. All right, human subject research. I think this will be where we conclude. Same kinds of questions. Can we use humans in research, and under what conditions? And the Nuremberg Code was the first attempt to answer these with a set of principles used to guide human experimentation. And most of you probably know that the Nuremberg Code came out of the Nazi doctors' trial in Nuremberg, Germany, after World War II, where it was discovered that there was a lot of medical experimentation that was being done in concentration camps. And so I'm just going to show you a bit of the Nuremberg Code. And this is the very first item in the very first line. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. And the Nuremberg Code is not law in any country that I know of, but the ways in which we govern research with human subjects in most countries is very similar to the elements in the Nuremberg Code. And in particular, I'm not aware of any country on the planet who doesn't think that voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. But then you raise the question of what does that mean? Well, it means you have to have the legal capacity to give consent. So you're of age, you're an adult, and you haven't been deemed legally incompetent. You should be able to exercise free power of choice. I'm not sure if you can see, now you can't see where my cursor is, the third line. Free power of choice means you're not coerced into doing it. And then about 5 lines down, and should have sufficient knowledge and comprehension of the elements of the subject matter involved as to enable him to make an understanding and enlightened decision. So that means if you're going to agree to participate in research, you need to know what they're trying to do, what it means for you, etc. And also the voluntariness typically means if any of you have signed a consent form, you can stop participation at any time and request to be removed. The other thing that's interesting here is the last paragraph. The duty and responsibility for ascertaining the quality of the consent rests upon each individual who initiates, directs, or engages in the experiment. It is a personal duty and responsibility which may not be delegated to another with impunity. So that means if you're a PI or a physician conducting research, you can't just say to your nurse, go in and get the signature for the consent form and act as though that actually absolves you of any responsibility to tell the patient what you're proposing. It doesn't mean that the nurse can't consent, but it means that then the nurse becomes the person responsible for making sure that this consent is legitimate, that it's actually understanding that there's no coercion going on, etc. All right, so now that we've had the whirlwind, a couple of quick things to conclude with, and then we can see if anybody's got questions. Thinking about research ethics can't make you a good person. I can't force you to care about these things if you don't already. But if you study these issues, you can get a map in your brain so you recognize them when you encounter them. So it's nice, so you can start to see something. Let's say you're working as an undergrad researcher in a hospital, and you're looking at the way these consents are happening, and you're like, I don't know that that person really understood what's going on. And I feel like the PI is brushing their concerns aside, right? This helps you see something coming down the road, which then you could either do something about, you can extricate yourself from the situation, you can try and resolve it, etc. But knowing when something's coming gives you at least some time to act. And this sort of last line, prophylactic or protective ethics is better than crisis management, means thinking about the right thing to do ahead of time is going to help you avoid these kind of crisis situations. So the bottom line is you have to think about the ethical components of what you do, right? If you're, I don't have enough time to get into that experiment. It's possible for all of us as human beings to say, well, so-and-so said it was okay, and so I'm just going with that, right? And not getting ourselves to think about ethical issues, but that doesn't mean you're actually in the right for doing it. The other thing is we have very few rules about research, actually. I know it feels like a lot of regulation, but they don't give you guidance in really complex situations. So you actually have to think about what the right thing is to do on your own. And so I'll stop it there and just see if there's any questions.
And while they're either writing their questions or coming off mute, there's two things that I love about this topic, right? One is I remember my philosophy class that I loved. The faculty member would talk about there's morals, there's ethics, and there's the legal, and they're distinctly different.
Yeah.
And sometimes they blend, right? And then the other thing I'll just say is this is a great opportunity. You got this content, you can come back and review this recording, but go talk to your faculty member about the ethics of their research, or see if you can observe it and pull it out and then have that conversation with your faculty mentor. It'd be kind of a cool exercise for you to try out.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
And I'll say, Dr. Rasmussen is fantastic. You're awesome. I always learn a tidbit from everybody, but the philosophy and the ethics of things is just always kind of fun and exciting to learn about. Maybe I'm a
It
nerd.
is.
Maybe I'm a nerd,
Oh,
but I
no.
like this stuff.
Yay, philosophy.
We got like 1 or 2 questions or 1 or 2 minutes if there's any quick questions for the faculty member. My quiet students on a Wednesday.
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome to Zoom life.
I know. Oh man, you guys, okay, I'm just gonna raise questions if you want, but man, during the pandemic, I had 120 students and all of them had their cameras off.
Oh, you're like
By-
talking to yourself, right?
Yeah, by a month in, I'm like, I could have lost internet and no, I would never know. And then I found out later, a couple of them were at work listening on phones. But it was pandemic. I was like, I'm not gonna,
Yeah.
you know, but it's like, I would get off of those calls and it's just like, I'm exhausted because you're like projecting into the dark screen.
It's
So
a different world.
It is a different world. Yeah.
All right. We'll give it 1 more minute. Any questions, comments? All right. Thank you so much. And thank you for Catherine and Kirsten, part of the OUR staff, for being here and doing your thing. And thank you, students. All right, everybody. Happy Wednesday. It's almost Friday.
Happy Wednesday. Happy hump day.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kristen, you're able to close us out and pull it down.